Hello and welcome to the De Morgan online lecture series. I'm Sarah Hardy. I'm the director of the De Morgan Museum, and today I'm going to be talking to you about William De Morgan's fascination with Islamic art. Thank you very much for joining us. In today's lecture, I'll be giving you an overview of Islamic art, talking to you about what we mean by the Islamic world, the Islamic religion, and how art is absolutely integral to the culture that has grown in the Islamic world in places that have a high population of Muslim people, and what that looks like and how the art sort of has come to characterize that culture. We'll also look at the Victorian perception of Islamic art, what some Victorian artists understood by it, how they interpreted it, and how they were inspired to use some of the key motifs, styles, and a lot of the structure of Islamic art in work of their own. We'll also have a look at that through the lens of sort of looking back on history from 2023 and thinking about imperialism, and in particular the element of that colonialism, so what impact that had sort of on the development of Islam globally, and particularly in sort of the high colonizing time of Victorian Britain, what that meant, the interpretation of Islamic art for British and particularly English artists was. And then we'll get on to talking about William De Morgan within the context of all of that. So how do William De Morgan's deeply Islamic inspired tiles that kind of fit into this very complex cultural religious matrix that was going on in the Victorian time, and indeed what the legacy of those artworks are today. So there's a lot to get through. The Prophet Muhammad said, "The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." I think this is a really apt quote to begin the talk with today. It really shows that the vast majority of Islamic art really does sort of focus on that religious belief, and it's absolutely integral to Islamic religion and culture, that the art is absolutely central to that, and the sort of the really high importance of having that artistic expression and visual representation of the religion is just yeah, absolutely central to Islamic belief. I think it also, this quote I loved because it kind of speaks to everything else that was born from Islamic culture, that deep importance of knowledge, scholarship, intellectual pursuits within the Islamic tradition, and thinking about various fields from the world, the parts of the world we're going to be talking about today, including vast developments in science, mathematics, philosophy, and how art has given a visual language to that. So Islam, first of all, let's talk about what we mean by Islam and think about the history of this world religion. Islam is a monotheistic Abrahamic religion founded on the belief of the oneness of God, or Allah, in the Muslim religion, and prophethood of Muhammad. It encompasses a system of beliefs, practices, and moral principles centered around the writings in the Quran, ritualistic prayers, charity, fasting, and pilgrimage to Mecca. And devote the promotion of godly ideals, social justice, and community. Community is absolutely essential to Islam. And this is often referred to as the 5 pillars of Islam. So 5 fundamental kind of ways of life that that Muslims will absolutely follow. This becomes sort of part of their life, part of their daily routine, and I think because of this, and you can see, sorry, I've got some people stuck in the waiting room. Bear with me 1 second. So apologies to everyone who's just joined us. The waiting room was supposed to be disabled, and yet you're all stuck in it. such is the nature of these mystery digital spaces, you have not missed very much. I have outlined what we're going to be talking about today in today's lecture, given a lovely quote from the Prophet Muhammad: the ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr, demonstrating the central element of art in Islamic culture. And then we were talking about what exactly we mean by Islam through the 5 pillars of Islam, these essential elements of the faith that Muslims follow and adhere to. And I'm just getting onto the part where I was saying that all of these elements there's a physical element to all of them. They really are not just about ideals. Lots of them are ritualistic and practical, meaning that the faith, the way of life in the Muslim world is one, I think, of great community and of kind of really being involved physically and practically. And I think it's therefore not surprising that there's such distinct and culture around the Islamic religion, and how that has kind of changed and adapted as it spread through the world, as we'll see. But fundamentally, these are sort of 5 key elements of the religion that people adhere to, people follow. There's a long history of Islamic faith, but really it began in the 7th century Common Era, CE is how I'll refer to it in this talk, but similar or the same dating as AD in the Christian calendar. And it began in the Arabian Peninsula, specifically in the city of Mecca, which is located today, presently in Saudi Arabia, just to give you an idea of geography in the world as we understand it today. The religion was founded by the Prophet Muhammad, who's considered the last prophet in a long line in the Islamic religion, including Adam, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. The key events in the early history of Islam include Muhammad's receiving of the revelations from Allah through the angel Gabriel, which were compiled into the Quran, which is, of course, the holy book of Islam. Muhammad's preaching and the growth of the community in Mecca led to opposition. As you would imagine, this was from the Quraysh tribe who ruled the city. Eventually, in 630 CE, Muhammad and his followers returned to Mecca after being exiled for a brief period, and he managed then to successfully establish the Islamic faith as the predominant religion. When Muhammad passed away in 632 CE, his teachings and the Quran became the foundation of Islam, and this rapidly then spread across the Arabian Peninsula in the centuries that followed, which you can see outlined on this table here. The expansion of the Islamic Empire in the 7th and 8th centuries under the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphs, the Islamic Empire extended rapidly during this period, from Spain to India. So geographically speaking, we see this kind of huge geographic expansion running through different peoples and different cultures, and also religions that were already there. And this led between the 8th and 13th centuries to an Islamic golden age, where there's a real flourishing, probably from the mixing together of all of these peoples and the coming together of great minds in science, philosophy, medicine, and art and architecture, which came to be a visual representation of the religion. With any expansion like that in history, there's always going to be opposition, and this led to a series of crusades in the 11th to 13th century between Christian Europe and the Muslim world, and that led to military clashes as well as cultural exchanges, as I mentioned, so positives and negatives. In the 13th century, there were also Mongol invasions, particularly the sack of Baghdad in 1258 had a profound impact on the Islamic world. The Ottoman Empire became a huge major Islamic power in the 14th century, and by the time it had conquered Constantinople, or present-day Istanbul in Turkey, this came to mark the end of the Byzantine Empire. So you can see this huge expansion spreading throughout the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. More recently, European colonial powers, particularly Britain and France, established control over many Muslim majority regions in countries in Africa and also in India. And I think through modernization, technological advances and advancing secularized world, this sort of did lead to a lot of kind of modernization and reform of the Muslim religion. Changes, of course, in the 21st century have been the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the aftermath of colonialism, and these huge technological advances that we've all witnessed recently. But the Muslim community and the Muslim world has become very integrated in part of the global community, and there's significant Muslim diaspora across the world today. So, and to enable us to kind of put all of that huge amount of information, not just in some sort of time order as I've tried to do here, but also to give you a visual representation of what that might look like through those different empires, expansions that I've talked about, how that sort of affected geographically what we mean by the Islamic world. So you can see that I'm not going to do it justice in today's lecture. We're talking about millions of people and thousands of miles of land. So the geographic spread and the spread through different cultures and existing religions of the growth of Islam in the last 2,000 years or so really has been enormous. And it's just not possible within an hour's talk, very specifically talking about one man's interest in art from the Islamic world, that we'd be able to talk about all of it. But I wanted to give you a sense of the very rich history, the deep cultural significance of some of the art we'll be looking at, but sort of to show you the expanse and the differences that we're going to see across some of the pieces that we look at as well. And so to Islamic art, I've sort of mentioned Islamic art a few times, and really art is just absolutely central to Islamic religion, yes, of course, but to this culture that I mentioned that's sort of grown up around the faith through it being such an active and practical religion, that I think community is absolutely at the centre of. And in order to share these ritualistic events through prayer and celebrations, there's a lot of coming together of people, and of course that leads to wanting this the culture and the art to go with it that has grown up around the Islamic world. Islamic art, as you can see there on the screen, is rich and diverse, characterized by intricate geometric patterns, arabesque and calligraphy. Those are the three key components of Islamic art, which we'll come on to. And they're often inspired by Islamic faith and cultural heritage. It encompasses a wide range of artistic forms. You're going to see some of these in the slides that I've got that follow. We're not just talking about art as in high art, which we might do if we're talking about art from the Western world. So gone are easel paintings for our talk today. And we really will be focusing on decorative arts, textiles, ceramics, mosques. Again, things that could very practically be used in keeping up the Islamic faith. So a beautifully illuminated Quran or a prayer mat that has been woven by hand. There's a lot of kind of ritualistic behavior in the making of these sacred objects and artifacts and making them beautiful, that again just shows an extra level of devotion and dedication and spiritual connection to the religion that people are following. So this is why I keep going back to this idea of it being a very ritualistic and practical religion, with going to prayer being a sort of daily event, and people fasting before Eid celebrations during Ramadan. There's a lot of ways in which kind of culture is practiced very practically, and I think this is why art and decorative objects are so important in Islamic culture, and we really do see that in some of the artworks that we'll be looking at today. So in early Islamic art. Some of the earliest examples of this decoration coming into these sites of religious practice are really influenced by pre-Islamic art and Byzantine art in these early areas. So art that was already existing around where the Islamic world grew up. And it really did initially focus on architectural elements like mosques and minarets with very simple geometric patterns. And of course, this is because there was a naivety about the art. It was in its infancy. It hadn't become fully developed. And yet people wanted to decorate their religious buildings in patterns that would lead to this idea of them being special and sacred and distinguishing them from domestic spaces. So great palace facade that we see on the screen here from a chateau in Jordan, which is now in a museum in Berlin, gives you an idea of what, you see how enormous this is as well, just in this tiny snippet in the picture, how impressive these buildings must have been. And really, I think, to give a profound sense of duty and calling to early followers of that religion. And you can see here that this is from about 740 in the Common Era. So this early Islamic art searched to create this very appropriate environment for worship, and it adhered to Islamic aesthetics, which discouraged the depiction of living beings. That was also something that came quite early on in Islamic art, and that's why we have these beautiful geometric forms rather than figurative decoration. So even at this early stage in the presentation, I wanted to draw your attention to a piece by William de Morgan, and we have the mosque and minaret tile panel, which is actually in Southwark art collection. This is by William de Morgan, probably designed either in partnership with Halsey Ricardo or it was executed under his command. Halsey Ricardo was a business partner that William de Morgan obtained or entered into partnership with in 1889 as he founded the Fulham factory, so the third period of William de Morgan's ceramic tile practice. The reason we think Ricardo was so involved in the creation of this piece and other pieces like it is that it was probably made as a commission for P&O, Peninsula and Orient steamliner ships, as they were then, cruise liners we might call them today. You can still book your holidays with P&O. But between De Morgan and Ricardo, they came up with these grand schemes for the interiors of luxury ocean liners, which would inspire a sense of exoticism and mystery in the passengers who were boarding these great luxurious ships in order to go to far-flung places of the world, which previously, sort of wouldn't have been available to the leisure traveller. And in here we see the very kind of British take on the mosques and minarets of these far off lands. So we've seen the decorative wall in the previous slide, and now we see sort of what that looks like in De Morgan's take on it. And actually, some of the key principles of the design are retained in De Morgan's version of it. So you can see the beautiful lattice work on the walls of the mosque here, the domes that are decorated in a beautiful geometric pattern. We have you can see with the brown colour, these are walls made out of brick that have been carved and decorated. And then we have the minarets, the towers that men would climb and give out the call to prayer. These are equally decorated, in this, again, beautiful geometric, very simplified patterns. So in this instance, I think whilst there is an element of the, sort of a dreamlike quality or an idealized version of the, Islamic world that Victorian Brits would be heading off to on their holiday, actually there is maybe an understanding of what this world was like and a certain adherence to it. In 1892, William de Morgan published a lecture on lustreware, He was very widely renowned with having reinvented this lost art from the Islamic world, which we will come to in a couple of slides' time. And in his 1892 lecture that he gave to the Society of Arts that was later published in their journal, so it is possible to read that in full, he gives a very long history of lusterware, which, like I've said, was an art that came out of Syria and moved through Egypt into Spain and Portugal as the Islamic world grew around it. So it is an Islamic art, I think it's safe to say. And in this, De Morgan gives, this really vivid account. He's obviously done lots and lots of research into the very specific areas and countries that lusterware came from, the different recipes he thinks people were using based on the look of the lusterware ceramics, and how he tries to redevelop that in his own practice. As well as that, De Morgan actually travelled to Egypt in 1894, having been commissioned by the Egyptian government to undertake a feasibility study into the possibility of reintroducing lusterware ceramic factories into Cairo. And some of his letters do exist in their transcribed forms in various publications and manuscripts in the De Morgan Foundation's collection. And he talks there about his time living in Egypt. And I think what we see in this decorative panel is perhaps the viewpoint of someone who is very much engaged with particularly Egypt, but certainly that wider Arab culture, and someone who maybe is being a bit more sympathetic to that culture. Having said that, it's still very stylized. It's still a very idealistic look at another world, and it does feel like it's sort of othering another culture. So we come on to sort of, as we move forward through time, the medieval Islamic art from the 10th to the 13th century. And here we have a beautiful image of a tile with a phoenix on it. You can see the phoenix's wings here and these beautiful swirling tail feathers of this piece. Probably from Iran. This was after the Mongol Crusades that we've talked about, and this kind of great impact that this had on Islamic art was to almost add an element of Chinese aesthetic into art from the Islamic world. So again, mixing different cultures and worldviews into the visual representation of what it meant to sort of be part of the Islamic tradition or religion. And I think that this sort of period of Islamic art really did have an impact on De Morgan's tiles. And one example of that, it's very obvious, is in his naming this design Mongolian. It's from probably the Merton Abbey period of his career, so the period prior to the Fulham period I've just discussed with the mosque and minaret panel. He called it Mongolian, and you can definitely feel a more kind of Chinese element to this design than some of his other work, particularly that sort of visual representation of a landscape with a mosque in it. The shapes of some of the flowers here, that kind of very jagged, stylized floral motif, does really feel, to my mind anyway, like it comes from a more kind of Chinese origin than a more southern kind of Middle Eastern area. Definitely something that you wouldn't find in the Indian subcontinent. And so yeah, I think this kind of the period around the sort of 10th to 13th centuries after the Mongolian Crusades really did impact and influence William de Morgan's art, and he was looking to very specific periods to influence his designs and allow him to develop new designs. So rather than just looking at everything all at once and maybe putting it together, this naming of this design specifically, I think, shows how interested he was in developing a sort of accuracy around the Islamic art he was using, and maybe giving a bit of a nod to the cultural tradition of that. We mentioned the golden age of Islamic Islamic arts in the development of the Islamic world in previous slides. And I think, as I mentioned previously, the idea of the golden age in Islamic art really was marked by these significant advancements in science and philosophy, and how that represented itself in art, it's not surprising, I don't think, is through calligraphy and manuscripts, the art of the written word, sharing knowledge, not just within the Islamic world, but wider afield as well, putting these ideas down in a format that could be preserved and shared. So as much the kind of preservation and sharing of knowledge as it is the beautiful decorative elements and this kind of wonderful gilding that we see in this Quran from 13th century Seville. So yeah, kind of this transmission of knowledge really came through, and as well as celebration, a celebration of these big successes and achievements of the era. Beg your pardon. I think the Islamic art developed around this time as well into non-Arab Muslim regions as it spread into India and Spain, and that had a profound effect on arts and culture that was already present in those areas. If you think, I should have put this in the slide actually, but the Alhambra in Spain, of course, shows that sort of Andalusian take on Islamic art, or the other way around, depending on how you look at it. But we definitely start to have these huge cross-cultural exchanges where new art is brought with the Islamic expansion into well-established cultural centres that already have their own visual language, and the two sort of become merged, resulting in quite unique and beautiful art and architecture. Similar story with the Islamic expansion into Ottoman and Safavid empires. The architecture in particular developed as stunning mosques and palaces with very intricate tile work. It's also around this period that the development of Iznik in modern-day Nicosia in Turkey became a powerhouse of ceramic export, and that was really exemplified by the beautiful arabesques you can see in the dish here, and these wonderful sort of quite stylized, flattened geometric formats, all very much based on vegetal imagery. So there's, even though it's very stylized, very geometric, you still get a sense that there's a naturalistic underpinning or influence there that is based on something floral, and that really did come from the Iznik exports in the 16th century. Modern Islamic art, we're going to fast forward past De Morgan briefly for me to tell you, of course, the Islamic art is very much still alive and well and being practiced today. And a really fabulous example of that I'm sure some of you will know about and will have seen is Shahzad Ghaffari's mural in the newly opened Leighton house. This really encapsulates modern Islamic art in my mind. Contemporary Islamic artists draw the inspiration from traditional forms, but kind of add new mediums and styles to that. And this being a huge painted fresco, but with calligraphy up the middle of it, winding around a staircase in a Victorian house that was very much built up around Leighton, the Victorian artist's exploration of the Islamic world through his collection of tiles, to my mind, just picks up on lots of things I've been saying about this being a celebration of cultural exchange and making a visual art form that would represent the true kind of shared culture and heritage that came around the Islamic religion. In this piece, Ghaffari draws particularly on a 13th century Persian poem by Rumi, exploring the universal theme of love and knowledge, and she weaves the words through the calligraphy there into a great abstract form which rolls up the new spiral staircase at Leighton House. It's called Oneness, and really that does sort of bring everything together that I've been talking about in this great history of Islamic art. And so to the Victorians and what they understood of everything that I've put into this presentation so far. In 1882, William Morris said, "To us pattern designers, Persia has become a holy land, for there in the process of our time, our art was perfected, and thence above all places it spread to cover for a while the world, east and west." I should have just said that, really. If you can't get the words yourself, you often find that William Morris has them for you. What a beautiful way of putting all of that into one sentence. He picks up there on the spread of this art and culture through religion. Of course, this statement is in many ways kind of problematic as well. During the Victorian era, artists and scholars and academics, and even the general public, would use the term Persia to refer to modern day Iran. But when they talked about Persian art, they would often mean artwork that had come from across that great expanse of geographic region that I've just referred to. We've seen already in William de Morgan that there was an acute understanding of actually where specific designs, motifs, and objects came from, and certainly in Morris as well. You know, he was intelligent enough not to just assume that everything Persian had come from modern day Iran. But really, this term did become a sort of catch-all to explain lots of art from the Middle East and from the wider Islamic world that had come to collections in Britain, in the UK. The British Museum had been established by this point in time, as had the South Kensington Museum, which is now the V&A, and their holdings of art from across time and geographic space relating to Islam were vast, and Victorian artists were able to see them then. So yeah, the term Persian doesn't really reflect the full scope, history and cultural diversity of all of the artwork that the artists were referring to. I think, crown jewel of Persian design, certainly to William Morris, was this, the Ardable carpet. It's now in the collection of the V&A. And has been since 1892. Slightly before that, it was still in the shrine of Sakhar Safi al-Din in 1843, where it could be visited and seen by British visitors. But after an earthquake, then it was put up for sale and bought by a Manchester carpet firm. And when Morris found out about that, he went to inspect it on behalf of the V&A and reported back to them its singular perfection. And the museum acquired the carpet for £2,000 in March 1893. It's the world's oldest dated carpet and comes from around 1334. And it really was then and still is now just a brilliant, an amazing example of Persian art. So the carpet actually can be dated exactly because of an inscription. So we've got the introduction and use of calligraphy in this carpet, which is one of those essential features of Islamic art. It's got so much rich detail, from arabesques to the floral shapes in it and the stylization, that it was this carpet that really did inspire William Morris to move into making his own carpet, such as the immense size of the thing. It's huge if you've never seen it, and the real ambition of colour and presentation of shapes and design, and the beautiful symmetry in it really did sort of take Morris off on his course to study carpets, and also I think cemented for a lot of artists and designers the idea that Persia was a holy land, and looking to designs from across the rest of the world really would impact their own artwork for the better. Prior to this, other artists had, of course, explored the Middle East, and travel had been made a lot easier with things like the advent of the railway and the steamships that I've already mentioned. And Frederick Lord Leighton, who of course lived at Leighton House before it became the museum with the beautiful Kafadi staircase that we've just looked at as we know it today in 2023, was owned by the artist Frederick Lord Leighton. And in the late 1870s, he decided it was about time to do something with the huge number of Damascene tiles that he'd collected from Syria on his travels. And what he decided to do was build a 2-story extension to his Holland Park home in London and call it the Arab Hall. And he enlisted the help of William de Morgan to install all of these tiles within the space that had been designed by the architect Sir George Aitchison. And so De Morgan had the, I think, impossible task of putting together these tile schemes that had not been designed or indeed made for the space he had to install them into. And I always just think square peg, round hole when I look at this image and think about the work that William de Morgan undertook to complete the scheme for Leighton. But complete it he did, and as you can see, it is completely beautiful. Again, I think it's very important to acknowledge that without colonial expansion from Europe, and in this case, particularly from Great Britain, it would have been impossible for Leighton to travel to Syria and collect up Damascene tiles that were being pulled out of religious and domestic sites and bring those with him back to the UK. Colonialism is the idea of historical and political systems where a powerful nation establishes and maintains control over foreign territories, usually in different regions of the world. During the Victorian era, British artists and designers drew upon global influences, including Islamic art, and that really does reflect that context of colonialism. This idea that one could go out and disrupt indigenous populations, take aspects of the culture that they wanted for themselves in order to develop and sort of have a bit of a look at the rest of the world as other and as lesser than one's own nation, really was a central imperialistic notion behind the colonial expansion. As the British Empire did expand, as we know it did hugely in the Victorian period, and when William de Morgan was born and as he was growing up and living, the British Empire extended across regions with Islamic heritage, including, as I've mentioned already, India, Egypt, and parts of the Middle East. And that expansion of people, colonialism means sort of physically applying one's own political systems into other parts of the world by physically being there. Of course, that meant an exchange of cultural ideas and artistic styles as well. And as these objects, like I said, were brought back in their thousands to museums here in London, that meant that artists could see them. And artistic endeavours, I think, often wanted to highlight the beauty and the aesthetic of these objects. I really do think that was at the heart of what they were trying to do, and that politically they could kind of divide those two things in their mind and make it all about the beauty of the art. However, I think in doing so, they really did underscore the power dynamics inherent in colonialism, and without colonialism being present, then they just wouldn't have understood the art in the same ways they did. It wouldn't have been exciting, exotic, glamorized, and therefore almost adding those elements of celebration to the colonial expansion. I just think it's very important that we do acknowledge that when we're talking about these subjects. Frederick Lewis is another artist I'd just like to bring to our attention in this talk, as he was an English Orientalist painter who really did specialise in creating these scenes from across the Islamic world, particularly in the Mediterranean and in Egypt. He lived in a traditional mansion in Cairo for many years, and this painting, The Reception, shows a an interior scene. It's one that's of, I think, particular interest because I think it gives us an idea that maybe Lewis was trying to do something to deconstruct some of the negative ideas that people in Victorian Britain had about the Muslim world, and particularly its treatment of women. In this beautiful house, we see the lady of the house sort of leaning across this divan, but actually in the sort of house that she's in, actually a woman would never have been present within that particular space. So through his pictures, perhaps Lewis isn't always giving a realistic view of Islamic culture and Islamic life, but perhaps is trying to, like I say, deconstruct some of those negative stereotypes that people had of particularly the mandara, or this house that the figures in this painting are featured in. What we can see in this incredibly detailed, minutely beautiful picture by Lewis are some of the aspects of Islamic art that had sort of all come together through everything we've discussed today, that geographic expansion through space and time and history, bringing together sort of a very distinct aesthetic style. And these are the geometric elements you see in the beautiful stained glass window here, through the sort of circular patterns here and the more linear geometric patterns. We've got the wonderful lattice work dividing the house interior and exterior. There are also these stained glass elements with of the swirling arabesques, these wonderful sort of S-shaped forms that made up so much of Islamic art. And if you look very, very closely, then I'm sure there'll be elements of the design where you could perhaps pick up calligraphy, perhaps in the tiles or something. But those three key elements are definitely were known to Lewis, and you do see a lot of this in the beautiful pictures he created. And of course, a man who we know was absolutely indebted to art from the Islamic world was, of course, William de Morgan. And here we see him in a picture painted by his wife of him in 1909. One of his staffs, Mr. Bale, said about William that thanks to his countrymen give him, after spending several fortunes on it, not only in perfecting lustre, but being, I maintain, the first to revive that beautiful lost art, as well as improving the glorious Persian colouring. Absolutely, may I say, giving it away, actually showing others how to do the lustre. Yet not a writer has given him his due, and that was Bale writing in the 1910s. So I'm going to give him his due today, and as I know many people since that comment was made have done. But De Morgan's interest, I do think, in the Islamic world, first of all, came through lustre, this brilliant and very complex method of glazing ceramics with metallic glaze that oxides, with a metallic oxide in it that oxidizes during firing, leaving just a metallic slip on the clay bowl. This was something that was developed in Syria before spreading through Egypt and Europe, and then all but becoming a lost art, as you know, in the modern Islamic world. And William de Morgan is very widely credited with having seen these ancient and historic examples of the Islamic art of lustre glazing in the British Museum, and coming up with his own recipes and methods for reinventing it and recreating it. But I don't think we can ignore that in doing so, he was obviously very much inspired by the decorative elements and the aesthetic of the pieces. It was never just a case of copying the glaze. He was also deeply interested in the design element of that, and used that as a point of influence in his own designs as well. Symmetry was really kind of important to De Morgan in his designs, and we see here, I've actually got my left and right the wrong way around on some of these slides. I apologise for that, but actually on the left we have the William de Morgan example of these two lustre winged panthers around a central line of symmetry, and opposite that we've got a bull with riders from 13th century Syria. Both pieces executed with decorative elements, pulling the central figures together and pulling your eye up and around the plate and down through the design, merging together the form of the ceramic and the decorative elements of it, and also being both executed in this fabulous monochrome luster glaze. The example on the right hand side using a silver oxide to give a more yellow hue to the luster, and William de Morgan on the left using a copper oxide to give this wonderful ruby luster, is how we refer to it, because that red shines so brilliantly like a ruby. So we've talked about this already, but just to reiterate, some of the key elements of Islamic art are geometric patterns to represent the infinite and undying nature of Allah, symbolizing balance, order, and harmony in the universe. We've got the arabesque, this beautiful flowing sort of organic form around which the decorations are arranged, and calligraphy, or the word of Islamic verses. So it picks out very important sacred texts from the Quran and decorates those again to really embellish them, show their importance in Islamic religion. De Morgan didn't use all of these elements, but two really in particular that he did focus on were the geometric patterns and the arabesques. So we see an example of a beautiful carved stone archway with these integrated geometric forms, very similar to the ones we've been looking at throughout on the slides. And De Morgan was very aware that giving his designs a geometric underpinning would create a rather beautiful unified design. So even though he was using very elaborate patterns, and he'd always had a rigorous structure to these. And what I've got here is a hexagon, and then hopefully you can see that same hexagon again underpinning the design here. So whilst it looks like a beautiful flowing piece with rotational symmetry around the surface of the dish, actually the very basic pattern of this is a hexagon. And De Morgan did always look to those very rigid geometric nets in order to make his designs. And a piece in which we really see that is this design, which is in the collection of the V&A. I've been to see this in person, so even though this is a terrible reproduction, I can explain it to you. There are pinholes on all the points in the net of this beautiful pelican here and sunburst dish, showing that De Morgan has used either a pair of compasses or a rudimentary compass of a pin, a piece of string, and a pencil. That will do the job just as well. And he's made a very basic geometric net. If that had been left undecorated, it wouldn't have looked dissimilar to some of the patterns that we see in the backboard of this beautiful Islamic niche. However, he has gone for it and completely embellished and decorated that in a very deftly De Morgan style, particularly I think with the pelicans and their beaks pointing into the triangular dips of each arc of that circle. But this piece in particular, to my mind, shows his real commitment to using geometry. And you see that again on the reverse of a lot of his plates, whilst the fronts of them are often asymmetrical. So he'll have a central motif of an animal. Often the backs of the plates, in order to, again, emphasize the circular form, will be decorated with a geometric pattern. And here, that's exactly what we have. This piece was actually painted by De Morgan's member of staff, Fred Passenger. We have the bullseye in the center here, then with the wonderful imbricated net pattern filled with the wonderful leaves, and then sort of a complementary secondary pattern on the edge of the bowl. And to give you an example of, as I've mentioned, this great asymmetrical motif taken very clearly from the more Persian elements of design, so the Iranian art from the Islamic world. What we have around the top is a deeply geometric repeat pattern, showing that De Morgan was keen to use as many aspects of Islamic art as he could in his own artwork. The arabesque, of central importance, as we've seen. And the arabesques on the left that we're looking at, again, left and right's the wrong way around, apologies about that. But the image on the left is from Leighton House. So these are 15th and 16th century Damascene tiles from Syria. Very astute use of the arabesque. The arabesque forms, a huge number of tiles which made vast mosques in Damascus. And in De Morgan's one tile example, you can see how he's taken elements from the tiles he saw firsthand when he was installing them in Leighton's Arab Hall into his own later designs. And I love how that piece flows. You can imagine if that piece was repeated, you'd have these wonderful arabesques across your whole wall. And I've already mentioned that Morris was a big advocate of the use of Persian elements of designs in his work and his own design work. And here we have a Morris and Morgan collaboration for Membland Hall. And this is very early design for ceramics by De Morgan, influenced by Morris, and you can see there these are absolute beautiful arabesques, these great swirling saz leaves, which is a key motif in Islamic art, which we'll come on to at the end. But you can see how both the vines and the leaves here have this wonderful meandering effect in the overall tile panel. Another arabesque that De Morgan was deeply interested in is this very standard pattern from Istanbul, from both from Islamic art and from the Islamic world. This kind of pattern, you find one in Leighton House. I know that the example I've got up here is from a mosque in Istanbul, and on the right hand side we have De Morgan's interpretation of that, slightly different to the original, slightly different to the tiles he'd seen at Leighton House, but I think across huge portions geographically of the Islamic world, this exact design, or very, very similar to this design, with the arabesques, flowing saz leaves, and two sort of central floral stylized motifs comes up quite often. And so I think it's brilliant that De Morgan did copy that and reinterpret it into his own designs. Don't need me to tell you probably that floral designs were of huge importance to William De Morgan, and we have the comparison here between the original and the De Morgans on the right hand side. The De Morgans, a beautiful vase of flowers here overflowing with those flattened stylized carnations, very similar to the original. The Islamic lattice, wow, I mean, used to amazing effect here on this mosque in Iran, in that beautiful carved work, but also emphasized by that really detailed, beautiful coloring and decoration. And on the right hand side, De Morgan's lattice design there. I think that the lattice in particular is sort of a beautiful thing to think about. The symbolism of that is sort of about this, what's on the surface and what's beneath it in Islamic art. And I think for William De Morgan, carrying sort of some spiritualist views as he did, the lattice would have been quite important to him. Also, practically having latticed windows and doors and walkways really served for a dual purpose of ventilation and privacy from the inside to the outside. So again, we're thinking about those two discrete spaces separated by something physical, maybe a distinction between the material and spiritual worlds, which again we know was sort of deeply important to De Morgan, even though that was in a spiritual sense, not an Islamic religious sense. There is definitely an overlap there. The mihrab is a very essential element of Islamic art, and now correctly on the left we have the mihrab of prayer niche, again from a mosque in Iran, and on the right hand side De Morgan's almost depiction of that, almost like his drawing of it, because this is a tile panel rather than a tiled niche as it is on the left. But you can see here his knowledge an understanding of Islamic architecture as much as the elements of the design, the creation of the tiles, and the copying of the ceramic tile surfaces. Oh, cypress trees. They've gone somewhere. There we go. Cypress trees were, yeah, another fundamental element of design from the Islamic world, with their tall, beautiful, slender form. They're often used to symbolize spiritual ascent, and so we can see why they were so important in Islamic design. And here we have one of De Morgan's sort of takes on that. I'm not very sure this is exactly a cypress tree, but certainly the shape of that great leaf in the middle really does show a reference point to that. I'm sure everybody watching this knows that William de Morgan did enjoy using a peacock motif. Peacocks are so often used in Islamic art because they're symbols of beauty, resurrection, and the soul's journey towards God. I think De Morgan liked them more decoratively than that, but here we have his sort of take on the original, and you can really see there with this beautiful asymmetry that you know, these two, he almost could have directly copied the one on the left in mirror to create his own dish, which I love. Back to Leighton House, and I keep going back to Leighton House because this was one of the greatest first-hand experiences De Morgan had with Damascene tiles. I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact that De Morgan had to make replicas because some of the tiles got smashed, some of them were lost, and he had to make full schemes for spaces the tiles weren't invented for, which often meant he had to create new tiles that were exact matches or exact symmetry of the original so that he could complete the schemes. And in this piece, actually, it's unique because we can tell which one's the De Morgan. In Islamic art, no living creatures are able to be depicted, as it's considered disrespectful, because no depiction of a living creature could match God's beauty of a real life living creature. And so the original parrots have got their necks slit, I'm sorry to say, so you can see this slice here across this parrot's neck on the top two parrots and these two at the bottom here, and on these sort of lion dog things chasing down these lions. Anyway, De Morgan's parrot does not have its neck slit. Not being Muslim, he was able to depict a living creature. Fish come to symbolize abundance and fertility. Obviously, we're going fishing, and sometimes divine blessings as well. They're commonly seen in decoration, but as with the birds, they're often depicted dead. So again, with a slit neck and sort of this almost like a trompe l'oeil, isn't it, to put a fish on a plate as though you're about to eat it, when actually it's decorating the plate. Do you see what I mean? A plate that you might eat fish off has the decoration of a fish. I've always thought there's something quite comical in there when looking at De Morgan's fish plates. But in his depiction, again, we see a fish that definitely looks alive, contrary to its Islamic counterpart there. Dia had great significance in Persian or Iranian wares, and they came to be quite a key motif, particularly during the Ilkhanid rule in Persia, after the Mongols conquered Persia during the early 13th century and sacked the Abbasid capital of Baghdad in 1285. And Dia, I think, with their being hunted, maybe, came to be a huge symbol of that, and lots of Iranian Persian ceramics from that period do have the deer as a motif. So it's no surprise that in looking at Iranian original ceramics, De Morgan picked up on this and used the deer quite extensively in some of his own designs. The crescent moon, another key motif found in Islamic art, and we see it here used on De Morgan's beautiful jardinier, the right way up and sort of upside down, all across this wonderful arabesque there. The star and crescent moons are the symbols of Islam, and often just stand to represent the faith itself, but also symbolize guidance and light, and so it's lovely to see those kind of embedded into the designs here for De Morgan's jardinier. The OG shape is the wonderful kind of double S shape you see so often in the tops of mosques and in doorways and in architectural features in Islamic art. And this was another key motif to De Morgan. He used this a lot throughout his work. The specific symbolism of the OG does vary from place to place, and depending on the kind of culture and historical context of when the piece was made. So in De Morgan's piece, actually, there's no symbolism if you think of it in that way. But its graceful curves are thought to represent harmony and balance, mathematical precision, and of course there's also an upward point to them. So this gives the idea, like with the cypress tree, of spiritual ascent in Islamic buildings. As you enter the mosque, you're going to a sacred place, and you want your prayers to be carried to the heavenly realm. And so the OG sort of points your prayers in that direction, which is a beautiful way of thinking about it. Thank you for staying with me. One more motif of Islamic art, as used so beautifully by William de Morgan to talk about, and that is the saz leaf. On the left-hand side, we have a tile from, again, from the Iznik region of Turkey from the 16th century, a key motif in the Islamic world, very easy to spot for its wonderful kind of curved form and jagged edges. And I don't think it was any accident that in painting her husband in 1909, the artist Evelyn de Morgan put the saz leaf absolutely slap bang in the centre and foreground of the portrait that she painted of her husband. The saz leaf is often featured in Islamic art and holds huge symbolic significance, because of its cultural and aesthetic connotations, natural beauty and harmony. This graceful elongated shape represents the beauty of the natural world. There's the spiritual ascent again in all the points on the leaves, and the overall kind of upward point of the leaf. Used in architectural elements, it can symbolize that ascension, but also contemplation and reflection. There's a continuity and a unity to it. If you were to trace the leaf all the way around, you'd end up back where you started. As with many of the motifs we've looked at today, they're continuous. There's a geometric precision to it. So the saz leaf is often depicted as a symmetrical form as well. And on the whole, I think it came for De Morgan to be a really useful element of his design work, as it was such a versatile piece. But I do think in some way he also probably did understand some of the cultural significance of using this motif in his own artwork. So even though the artistic engagement with De Morgan did centre, I think, around the fascination with the aesthetic of the other, which obviously has to be understood as part of wider imperialist attitudes, colonialist expansion of the country and the time in which De Morgan lived. And part of now how we look back on that and understand Orientalism and that desire to other the East and make it into something luxurious and aesthetic and mysterious. What we also have to do is look at De Morgan's work as a testament to kind of the cross-cultural exchanges of that time, I think, and see how his looking to the influence of other cultures actually was part of his own educated journey towards reflecting some of the global dynamics of the time. So, you know, we might want to call it cultural appropriation, but I think in terms of it being a use of an aesthetic and a design that actually we stand to learn a lot now from the beautiful pieces, just as I think De Morgan learned a lot from engaging with beautiful art from the Islamic world in his own time. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture today.